Hi everybody, welcome to Skillsoft Off the Shelf. I'm Tara O'Sullivan for Skillsoft, and today I'm delighted to welcome Michael Rena, whose book Adaptive Space we're going to be talking about today. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. Tell me, why did you write Adaptive Space and who really is the audience for the book?
We live in really interesting times, and if you think about it, just read the newspapers on a day-to-day basis and you can hardly get past the front page before you hear about an organization that's going bankrupt, an organization that is merging with another organization, or at least one that is poised for disruption. So, I wrote Adaptive Space really to respond to that dilemma, to respond to this dilemma of, we live in the era of disruption. John Chambers says it best, in a little quote where and quite starkly, where he basically says that, organizations today must transform, they must reinvent themselves, or they will be disrupted. And he goes on to say it will be a brutal disruption to the point where organizations won't exist in the next 10 to 15 years as they do today. And I just don't think that we have responded as organizational scientists to come up with the solution for that. So Adaptive Space is really to shift that narrative. Adaptive Space is really to help organizations transform because they're mostly not capable of doing that, at least in today's modern era of disruption. So the book is really intended first for leaders to shift that narrative, to challenge leaders to think beyond the one-size-fits-all approach and to think about multitude of sort of social connections and arrangements, and also for individuals within organizations to help them really think about their ideas and think about how they can get their ideas, first of all, enacted inside of an organization, shifted, and then ultimately adopted inside of an organization through a few sets of principles.
You talk a lot in the book about how companies are being disrupted and they're not actually doing anything different about it. They're allowing it to happen, they're ignoring it, they're maybe making one or two tweaks, but they're not really changing how they do things. How can Adaptive Space help companies who are being disrupted?
We shouldn't be surprised by that notion. Organizations have grown up, they're successful because they are where they are, and whenever change hits them, they try to double down on what I called ordered response solutions, which is, let's put in more control and command. Let's put in more, sort of process and standardization, when in reality, what they need is what we call an adaptive response. So Adaptive Space is really predicated on this simple fact, and we discovered this through a decade worth of research. Organizations must have operational systems. That's how they pay the bills. But many organizations also, all organizations that we looked at also had entrepreneurial pockets of activity. The challenge was getting those new ideas deep inside these pockets inside of an organization, really sort of seeded into the operational system, if you will, so that they can scale them and produce greater results for sort of future growth. And that's the concept of Adaptive Space. I describe it as a social bridge, between these entrepreneurial pockets and the operational system, so that organizations can be fast and nimble by creating new ideas inside these pockets, but can also be stable enough to produce results. And both are incredibly necessary. And unfortunately, it's very rare. There was a McKinsey study done not long ago that suggests that less than 12% of companies are able to do those two things combined.
Are there different people, as in talent, that you need in the keeping all the lights on and keeping everything normal versus in the entrepreneurial pockets? So do you target people, do you invite people, or do you allow people to put their hands up? How do you change the talent?
Sort of the core of Adaptive Space. First of all, I spent almost my entire career in the talent space. So I've been looking at skills and experiences and human capital, for most of my career. And I think the real sort of central component to Adaptive Space is we're shifting from a world of human capital into sort of a new era of social capital. So the short answer is yes, there are different people, but far more importantly than that is the way you arrange those people is far more critical. So think about it this way. Human capital is what you know and what experiences you have, based on previous, encounters that you've had. Social capital is about how well you're positioned to leverage what you know. So, Adaptive Space, in short, is really how do you position people in different social configurations so that they can be adaptive and responsive. And that requires a multitude of different types of people, but just as importantly, a multitude of different social arrangements.
Can you share the concept of 4D connections in your concept of adaptive space?
Organizations can no longer rely on these one-size-fits-all, sort of mindsets of this is what we do to produce results. So they've got to constantly be fluxing and shifting and responding to what's happening in the outside world. So the very first thing they need to do is they need to be discovering. They need to constantly have people outside the organization so that they don't become insular and they're paying attention to the speed of the world around them so that they can respond and enact new solutions and future growth possibilities. But that's not enough. Ideas are cheap. And organizations can generate all kinds of ideas through discovery connections, but they've got to bring them into the world. And to do that, it's like a whole different set of configurations. Amazon describes them as two pizza teams, small, cohesive teams that are very deeply trusting of one another with redundant connections, and they're wonderful at bringing ideas into the world. They get ideas from conception into reality, and they build minimum viable products. But that's not enough. Oftentimes what happens is you generate a new idea inside of one of these pockets, and then the antibodies kick in. The rest of the organization rejects it, and what we know is 43% of the time something designed in one of these entrepreneurial pockets will be stifled out by the broader organization. So then you need to shift to what I call diffusion connections, which is thinking about how do I get the organization buzzed up? How do I seed the organizational network in order to get other people encouraged about this idea? And how do I go find energizers that will really help to advocate for this idea? And then ultimately, those three sets of connections lead to the fourth one, which is a set of disruption connections, which really help to usher in the new normal. It disrupts the status quo, ushers in this new idea, and then sort of jumps to the next set of possibilities.